There's a strange moment that happens when you realize a piece of history didn't disappear naturally, because once that thought takes hold, every official explanation you've ever trusted starts sounding rehearsed, and you begin to wonder how many times you've accepted silence as truth simply because it was presented calmly. I didn't arrive at this story by searching for mysteries, and that's important because the most convincing erasures aren't hidden behind locked doors or classified stamps, but buried inside ordinary records that look complete until you notice they all avoid the same detail in exactly the same way. What first caught my attention wasn't what was written, but what stopped being written, because references that had appeared casually for years suddenly vanished, as if someone had decided that even mentioning the subject carried a risk that outweighed curiosity. At first, I told myself this was normal, that time destroys information unevenly, and that history is full of gaps. But that explanation collapsed the moment I realized these gaps weren't random, weren't regional, and weren't gradual, because entire threads were removed simultaneously across sources that had no reason to coordinate unless coordination was the point. That's when the uncomfortable question surfaced, not about what was missing, but about who had the reach, the authority, and the urgency to make something disappear so completely that later generations wouldn't even know what to look for. I won't give you names yet, and I won't give you dates, because the fastest way to escape a disturbing idea is to label it and file it away as something distant, when the truth is that this erasure sits much closer to the foundation of what we're taught than most people would ever be comfortable admitting. What matters right now is the pattern, because once you see it, you can't unsee it, and the pattern begins with brief acknowledgments that fade abruptly, followed by explanations that feel oddly defensive for events that are supposedly insignificant. You start noticing that later historians don't argue against the lost material or explain why it was wrong, but instead write around it, constructing narratives that function perfectly only if you never ask why certain questions were never raised in the first place. That behavior is subtle, but it's also revealing, because disagreement leaves evidence, while erasure leaves silence, and silence is far more expensive to maintain over time. Somewhere in this process, history stops feeling like a record of what happened and starts feeling like a controlled version of what was allowed to survive. And once that shift occurs, even the most trusted timelines begin to feel provisional. The detail that finally made it impossible for me to ignore wasn't dramatic, and that's what made it frightening, because it was a simple cross-reference that should have existed, but didn't, repeated often enough that coincidence stopped being a reasonable explanation. When you realize that something has been removed so thoroughly that you were never meant to know it was missing, you also realize why stories like this are never introduced directly, but discovered accidentally, by people who weren't supposed to be looking. This wasn't buried by time, it was buried by decision. And once you understand that, the only question that matters isn't what was erased, but what would happen if it wasn't. Once you accept that the absence wasn't accidental, the story stops being about a single missing event and starts revealing itself as something far more uncomfortable. Because patterns don't require belief, only observation, and this pattern appears in places that were never meant to be compared. What makes it difficult to spot at first is that the erased pieces don't look connected on the surface, since they belong to different cultures, different eras, and different belief systems. But the method of disappearance follows the same logic so closely that coincidence becomes harder to defend than intent. You begin by noticing that certain discoveries are acknowledged briefly and then quietly dismissed, not challenged or disproven, but described as incomplete, unreliable, or inconveniently vague, which would be reasonable if it happened once, but becomes suspicious when it happens the same way again and again. In some cases, the original records still exist, but only as references to references, as though the primary material was removed while leaving just enough behind to suggest it once mattered, creating the illusion of transparency without the substance to verify it. What's unsettling is that this selective thinning of information doesn't target failures or embarrassments, but moments of advancement, anomalies that don't fit the accepted timeline, or knowledge that appears too early, too refined, or too disruptive to explain comfortably. You'll notice that when history encounters something it can't easily place, it often responds by isolating it, labeling it as myth or exaggeration, and then moving on, But in these cases, the response is different because the material isn't mythologized, it's minimized, stripped of context until it loses its power to raise further questions. That distinction matters because myths invite curiosity, while minimization invites indifference. And indifference is the most effective tool for ensuring something stays forgotten without ever having to deny it existed. As this pattern repeats, you start seeing gaps that don't line up with catastrophe or decay, because wars destroy randomly and time erodes unevenly. Yet these disappearances are clean, synchronized, and oddly polite, as though someone went through history with a list rather than a weapon. What's even more telling is how later explanations behave, because instead of addressing why certain information vanished, they focus on reinforcing what remains, strengthening the accepted narrative so thoroughly that questioning it feels unnecessary, even rude. This is where the discomfort deepens, because control doesn't always announce itself through force, but often through confidence, through stories told so smoothly that you never think to ask who edited them. At this stage, most people sense something is wrong, but stop digging. Not because they're convinced, but because the trail becomes inconvenient, scattered across disciplines that don't usually speak to each other, requiring patience instead of outrage. But if you keep going, if you place these silences side by side instead of examining them in isolation, you begin to realize that what was removed follows a consistent rule, one that avoids erasing entire civilizations, but targets specific moments where understanding could have shifted in ways that were difficult to reverse. And once that realization settles in, history stops feeling like a passive record of human memory and starts resembling an active system. One that doesn't just remember and forget, but selects, filters, and shapes what future generations are allowed to consider possible. The most disturbing part isn't that something was erased, but that the erasure worked so well that questioning it now feels like paranoia rather than curiosity, which is exactly what a successful disappearance is supposed to achieve. Because when the past is edited carefully enough, the present never suspects it's incomplete. The moment you start asking why the pattern exists, you inevitably encounter the first official explanation, because silence is rarely left undefended for long. And when it is challenged, it tends to respond with answers that sound reasonable, until you examine what they carefully avoid addressing. At first, the explanation feels familiar and even comforting because it relies on ideas we're trained to accept without resistance, like the unreliability of early sources, the exaggerations of ancient observers, or the simple claim that modern understanding has corrected earlier misunderstandings. On the surface, that logic holds, but it begins to fracture when you realize that corrections usually leave a trail because disproven ideas are debated, cited, and slowly dismantled in public view, whereas these particular claims weren't dismantled at all, but quietly removed as though discussion itself had become undesirable. What makes this stand out is that the explanation doesn't challenge the evidence directly, but reframes it as unnecessary to consider, which is a subtle but important difference because refutation engages with facts, while dismissal bypasses them entirely. As you follow this thread, you notice that the language used to describe the missing material becomes strangely cautious, filled with phrases that imply resolution without ever showing the process that led there, as if certainty appeared fully formed rather than earned. That's when it becomes clear that the explanation isn't designed to clarify what happened, but to close the conversation, because the moment something is labeled settled, curiosity becomes framed as ignorance rather than inquiry. The problem with this approach is that it assumes the absence of evidence is evidence of absence, while simultaneously ignoring the reason that evidence might be absent in the first place, which creates a loop that sounds logical until you realize it depends entirely on its own conclusion. What's more unsettling is that this logic is applied selectively, because history is full of gaps that remain open and debated. Yet these particular gaps are treated as resolved despite lacking the scrutiny usually required for such confidence. When you compare how similar uncertainties are handled elsewhere, the difference becomes impossible to ignore, because doubt is encouraged when it strengthens the accepted narrative, but discouraged when it threatens to complicate it. At this point, you begin to understand that the first lie isn't always a false statement, but a framing choice, a decision about which questions are allowed to exist and which ones are quietly made to feel inappropriate. This is where many people stop, not because the explanation is convincing, but because pushing further begins to feel socially and intellectually uncomfortable, as though curiosity itself is crossing an invisible boundary. But discomfort is often the clearest signal that you're approaching something protected, because ideas that are genuinely wrong don't require this level of insulation. And once you recognize that the explanation is functioning less like an answer and more like a barrier, you start to see it everywhere, shaping the way history presents itself as complete while quietly directing attention away from the places where continuity breaks down. That realization changes the role of the viewer in this story, because you're no longer observing a mystery from the outside, but standing at the edge of a narrative that was designed to be convincing enough that most people would never think to question it. Which raises the next problem, because if the explanation is intentionally shallow, then whatever it's protecting must be significant enough that even acknowledging uncertainty was considered a risk. And that's when the silence starts to feel less like neglect and more like policy. Once you recognize that the explanation functions more like a barrier than an answer, the story subtly shifts again, because the problem is no longer about individual omissions, but about entire stretches of time where the historical record behaves unnaturally quiet, as if something passed through and removed not just details, but momentum itself. These aren't chaotic gaps caused by disaster or collapse, because even in periods of war and instability, people leave traces, complaints, myths, fragments of continuity that suggest life was still unfolding. Yet here the silence feels structured, bounded, and intentional, beginning and ending too cleanly to be accidental. What keeps the trigger alive is that the silence doesn't appear everywhere, but only around specific developments, moments where change seems imminent and then suddenly stalls, forcing history to resume as though the interruption never occurred. You can feel it when you read closely, because the narrative moves forward confidently, then hesitates, then jumps, skipping over a span that should be crowded with cause and effect, leaving behind conclusions without processes, outcomes without origins. At first, this is easy to dismiss because we're conditioned to accept that not everything survives, but that comfort erodes when you notice how often these silence zones align with earlier references that hinted at something unresolved, something that was acknowledged briefly before being swallowed whole. What's unsettling is that later accounts don't treat these gaps as mysteries worth exploring, but as inconveniences best ignored, smoothing over the absence with general statements that sound complete only if you don't slow down long enough to examine them. This is where the trigger deepens, because the silence isn't passive, it's guarded, reinforced by confident summaries that discourage further inspection, making the absence feel intentional without ever admitting it exists. If you follow the thread carefully, you start noticing how quickly discussions move past these periods, how rarely questions are asked about what should have been happening during those missing years, and how often attention is redirected towards safer, well-documented outcomes. The pattern repeats often enough that it begins to feel less like forgetfulness and more like choreography, as though history was edited not just to remove specific facts, but to prevent certain lines of thought from ever forming. And this is where many listeners feel the urge to step back, because the idea that time itself could be selectively muted challenges the comforting belief that the past unfolds naturally into the present. But staying with that discomfort reveals something important, because silence on this scale requires maintenance, repetition, and agreement across generations, which means it isn't sustained by ignorance alone. What keeps the tension tight is the realization that these silence zones don't erase consequences, only their explanations, leaving us with a present shaped by decisions whose origins we're no longer allowed to see. That's when the story stops feeling historical and starts feeling immediate, because if parts of the past were removed to guide outcomes, then the present isn't just inherited, it's curated. And the most dangerous part of that realization is not that something was taken away, but that whatever replaced it has been convincing enough to keep us from noticing the difference. The trigger is still alive. Nothing has been answered. The pressure is increasing. Up until this point, it's still possible to believe that what disappeared did so, because it was inconvenient, embarrassing, or simply difficult to explain, but the story turns the moment you notice that the erasures didn't just remove problems, they removed alternatives. This is the point where the assumption quietly changes, because instead of asking what history was trying to hide, you begin asking what history was trying to prevent from becoming normal, and that shift reframes everything you've already heard. What becomes clear is that the missing material doesn't challenge the past so much as it challenges the direction the future eventually took, because what was erased consistently points toward paths not taken, developments that could have unfolded differently if certain ideas had been allowed to survive. That realization is unsettling, because mistakes are usually erased to protect reputation, but possibilities are erased to protect control, and control only becomes necessary when outcomes matter more than truth. When you revisit the silence zones with this in mind, they stop looking like gaps and start looking like forks in the road, moments where history could have branched but was instead guided firmly back onto a preferred path. What makes this difficult to accept at first is that we like to imagine the past as chaotic and ungovernable. Yet the evidence suggests that while no one controls everything, it doesn't take total control to influence direction, only enough authority to decide which ideas are allowed to persist. Up until this point, it's still possible to believe that what disappeared did so, because it was inconvenient, embarrassing, or simply difficult to explain, but the story turns the moment you notice that the erasures didn't just remove problems, they removed alternatives. This is the point where the assumption quietly changes, because instead of asking what history was trying to hide, you begin asking what history was trying to prevent from becoming normal, and that shift reframes everything you've already heard. What becomes clear is that the missing material doesn't challenge the past so much as it challenges the direction the future eventually took, because what was erased consistently points toward paths not taken, developments that could have unfolded differently if certain ideas had been allowed to survive. That realization is unsettling, because mistakes are usually erased to protect reputation, but possibilities are erased to protect control, and control only becomes necessary when outcomes matter more than truth. When you revisit the silence zones with this in mind, they stop looking like gaps and start looking like forks in the road, moments where history could have branched but was instead guided firmly back onto a preferred path. What makes this difficult to accept at first is that we like to imagine the past as chaotic and ungovernable. Yet the evidence suggests that while no one controls everything, it doesn't take total control to influence direction, only enough authority to decide which ideas are allowed to persist. The erased moments share a common trait, because they don't introduce chaos or destruction, but competence, knowledge, or understanding that appears earlier than expected, raising uncomfortable questions about how much of what we call progress is rediscovery rather than invention. This is where the story stops being about lost artifacts or forgotten events and starts being about narrative containment, the quiet management of what people are allowed to believe was possible at a given time. Once you see that, the first lie you encountered earlier makes sense, because it wasn't meant to deceive directly, but to frame curiosity itself as unnecessary, ensuring that even if fragments survived, they would never be assembled into anything threatening. The reversal settles in slowly, because it doesn't announce itself dramatically, but it lingers, changing the emotional weight of everything that came before, making earlier silences feel purposeful rather than negligent. At this midpoint, the trigger tightens because the danger is no longer located in the past, but in the realization that the present rests on a curated version of memory, one that limits not just what we know, but what we think is achievable. And that's when the question deepens again, because if history was edited to control direction rather than hide failure, then the most important thing that was erased wasn't an event, but a precedent, something that proved a different way forward existed. What's unsettling is that the beneficiaries don't need to coordinate consciously across centuries, because once a version of history becomes dominant, it sustains itself, rewarding those who operate within its assumptions and marginalizing those who question them. This is where the story resists naming specifics, not to be evasive, but because specificity would narrow the lens too much, turning a structural phenomenon into a personal accusation that's easier to dismiss. Instead, the benefit appears as insulation, protection from disruption, and the preservation of authority structures that rely on predictability, because alternative histories imply alternative futures, and alternative futures are difficult to manage. The trigger tightens again when you realize that the erasures didn't need to be permanent to be effective, because even temporary removal at critical moments can redirect understanding long enough for a preferred narrative to take root. Once that happens, restoring the original material becomes irrelevant, because the framework through which it would be understood has already been replaced. This explains why later attempts to reintroduce forgotten material feel awkward or fringe, not because they lack substance, but because they don't fit comfortably into the established story that everyone has learned to navigate. The benefit, then, isn't just power or control in the traditional sense, but continuity, the ability to maintain a stable version of reality across generations without constant reinforcement. And the most revealing detail is that this stability depends less on secrecy than on normalcy, because the safest way to protect an edited past is to make it feel unremarkable. At this point, the story has moved far enough that stepping away would mean returning to a version of history that now feels incomplete, which is why the trigger holds so tightly here. Because once you notice who benefits, you also notice what it costs to forget. Up to this point, the story has stayed safely abstract, dealing in patterns, systems, and quiet advantages. But the cost of remembering only becomes real when you stop looking at what was erased and start looking at what happened to those who noticed. What emerges first isn't a trail of dramatic punishments or public confrontations, because overt suppression attracts attention, but a series of small, almost forgettable outcomes that share a common effect, which is removal without spectacle. People who raised the wrong questions didn't vanish outright, but found their work stalled, their credibility softened by polite doubt, and their contributions slowly edged out of the conversations they were once part of. At a glance, each case looks ordinary, even reasonable, because careers end for many reasons and ideas fall out of favor all the time. Yet when you place these stories side by side, the similarities become difficult to ignore. The pattern isn't that dissent was punished, but that persistence was exhausted, because it's easier to let curiosity burn out than to confront it directly. What makes this especially effective is that the pressure rarely comes from a single source, but from a diffuse response that feels like consensus, where resistance appears unnecessary because no one seems openly opposed. In this environment, the cost of remembering isn't violence or imprisonment, but isolation, the quiet sense that continuing to ask certain questions will lead nowhere productive. That realization reshapes behavior more effectively than force ever could, because it teaches people to self-edit, to redirect their curiosity towards safer topics, and to interpret the absence of response as a sign that nothing important was ever there. Some did push through anyway, driven not by rebellion, but by the discomfort of unanswered gaps that refuse to close, and their stories tend to end the same way, not with confrontation, but with exhaustion. Their work remains unfinished, their ideas unintegrated, and their names mentioned only in passing, if at all, because half-remembered contributions are easier to absorb than fully realized challenges. This is where the emotional weight deepens, because the erasure of information is mirrored by the erosion of people, both happening quietly enough that neither looks like a crime. The trigger tightens further when you realize that remembering isn't discouraged because it's wrong, but because it's inefficient, because a system that relies on continuity doesn't benefit from reopening questions that complicate its foundations. At this stage, the listener understands that the past didn't just lose information, it lost advocates, people who might have connected the fragments if they'd been supported long enough to finish the work. And that leads to the most uncomfortable thought yet, which is that the reason these stories feel incomplete isn't because the truth was never found, but because the process of finding it was made unsustainable. Remembering, in this context, becomes an act that carries a cost not measured in punishment, but in patience, energy, and belonging. And the closer you get to that understanding, the harder it becomes to unsee the quiet mechanisms that made forgetting feel like the most reasonable option available. By the time you reach this point, it becomes clear that the story isn't circling a single secret or lost discovery, but something more fragile and more threatening, which is the idea that the past once demonstrated possibilities the present has been trained not to recognize. What made this knowledge dangerous wasn't that it contradicted what people believed, but that it reframed what they believed was possible, because belief can be negotiated, while possibility reshapes behavior in ways that are harder to contain. The erased material didn't promise domination or destruction, but competence, continuity, and understanding that appeared without the long struggle we're taught is necessary, suggesting that progress might not be as rare, fragile, or dependent on authority as we've been led to assume. That implication alone is enough to destabilize systems built on gradual permission. Because if people realize that certain capabilities existed earlier, emerged differently, or were once widely understood, then the present stops feeling like the peak of a long climb and starts feeling like a narrowing. This is where the final piece settles into place. Because the danger wasn't that the past held forbidden power, but that it held proof that alternative ways of organizing knowledge, responsibility, and progress had already worked before being forgotten. Once you understand that, the earlier erasures stop looking defensive and start looking preventative, because it's far easier to manage a future when the past offers only one acceptable path toward it. The silence zones, the minimized records, and the exhausted individuals all point toward the same function, which is not to hide a truth, but to keep it from becoming referenceable, because reference creates comparison, and comparison creates choice. This is the moment where the story feels closest to resolution, yet refuses to resolve, because the implication isn't tied to a single event that can be uncovered, but to a pattern that continues to shape what feels realistic today. What makes this especially unsettling is that the danger of this knowledge doesn't expire, because as long as the present depends on inherited assumptions, rediscovering earlier alternatives remains disruptive. That's why the story never ends with a reveal, because revealing a fact would be easier to dismiss than confronting a framework that's been quietly guiding expectation for centuries. The final piece, then, isn't an object or a document, but a realization, which is that erasure succeeds not by removing answers, but by removing the questions that would have led to them. And once those questions are gone, even the most extraordinary fragments can sit in plain sight without ever being recognized for what they imply. At this point, the listener understands why this knowledge wasn't debated openly or disproven publicly, because engaging with it honestly would have required admitting that the past was more flexible than the present prefers to be. Which leaves only one thing unresolved, because if the danger wasn't in what people would do with this knowledge, but in what they would stop accepting once they had it, then the decision to erase it starts making a quiet kind of sense. And that realization carries a weight that doesn't fade quickly, because it suggests that the most carefully protected secret in history may not be a fact at all, but the memory that things didn't always have to be this way. By the time the story reaches its end, it becomes clear that nothing was erased to keep the past mysterious, because mystery fades on its own, but to keep the future narrow, predictable, and easier to manage without ever having to explain why. What lingers isn't anger or revelation, but a subtle unease, the sense that the present you inhabit was shaped as much by what you were never shown as by what you were taught to remember. The most effective erasures don't leave empty spaces that invite investigation, but smooth surfaces that discourage curiosity, making the absence feel natural enough that questioning it seems unnecessary. That's why this story doesn't end with a discovery or a restored record, because restoration would imply closure, and closure would make forgetting easier again. Instead, it ends with responsibility, because once you understand that the past was curated, you also understand that the future doesn't have to be. The warning isn't that someone is hiding something from you right now, but that systems persist when they're no longer questioned, and history only stays edited as long as people accept it without noticing the seams. What was erased wasn't removed to protect you from danger, but to protect certainty from disruption, and certainty is far more fragile than it appears. The quiet truth is that nothing stops erasure better than attention, because forgotten things don't need defending, but remembered questions do. And the reason this story matters isn't because it reveals a hidden chapter of history, but because it reminds you that every version of the past is provisional, shaped by choices that can be revisited if someone is willing to look closely enough. So if there's a final thought to carry forward, it's not fear, but awareness, because awareness turns absence into inquiry, and inquiry keeps the future open in ways erasure never can. Some things aren't hidden to protect the past. They're hidden to protect what comes next. And once you've seen that, history never sounds the same again.